Amidst an approaching sandstorm, Sarah and her daughter Lily arrive at Maggie's last stop, seeking refuge and coffee, where they are met with wary hospitality from Maggie and her unconventional companions, Gina and Razor. Despite initial suspicion, a connection forms between Sarah and Maggie as they share their stories, suggesting the last stop is becoming a sanctuary for those seeking a fresh start. The last stop is a roadside coffee stand run by Maggie, a woman with a hidden past, and staffed by Razor and Gina, former members of the Iron Serpents biker gang. When a sandstorm hits, Sarah and her daughter Lily seek shelter at the last stop. Maggie, Razor, and Gina offer them hospitality, and Sarah begins to see the potential for the last stop to be a safe haven. As the storm subsides, Sarah and Lily leave, promising to return. Maggie looks out at the horizon, feeling a sense of peace and hope for the future. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. The last stop. The wind screamed, a feral beast tearing at the corrugated iron roof of the last stop. Whirlwinds danced on the cracked asphalt ribbon of the highway, tossing up ochre earth and skeletal weeds in a frantic jig. A pitiless sun blazed from the cloudless sky, distorting the sparse vegetation into shimmering illusions. Maggie Callahan, a study in composure, stood sentinel behind the counter, her hands, guided by years of practice, coaxed dark beans through the manual grinder. The rhythmic whir, a tiny act of defiance against the barren expanse. The resulting fragrance, deep and grounding, offered momentary sanctuary. The coffee stand stood as a testament to endurance, a defiant beacon against the desert's slow creep at a weathered sign. The lettering flaking like sun-parched skin, boldly declared its name, more shack than building, its faded paint the hue of dried-up blood. It nonetheless stood resolute, a promise of caffeine and brief respite to weary souls. Mac's gaze swept the empty horizon, honed by years on the periphery. She noted the subtle shift in air currents, the lengthening shadows, the almost imperceptible earth tremor that heralded an approaching vehicle. This was more than coffee. It was anticipation, preparedness made instinct. She tamped the grounds with firm, even pressure. Her knuckles, a constellation of scars, told silent stories of battles fought, both seen and unseen. She ignored the ache in her right hand, a phantom reminder of a life she yearned to shed. The espresso machine hissed, a comforting sound that briefly vanquished the wind's mournful keen. Mac watched the dark elixir trickle into the glass, crowned with a fleeting layer of golden crema. 2 pinpricks of light grew on the horizon. Steadily expanding, Mac straightened, her posture subtly shifting, muscles coiling with contained energy. A semi, its chrome flashing under the brutal sun, lumbered into view. The truck braked with a hydraulic sigh, a coiled serpent expelling its breath. From the cab emerged a man, leathery and worn like well-used tack. His movements stiff as he stretched. He was tall, wiry, his face a roadmap of countless miles. He walked towards the stand, boots stirring up dust with each step. No smile, no greeting, only a curt nod as he reached the counter. Coffee, he stated, his voice a dry rasp. Black. Mac met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. She saw the deep fatigue etched in his features, the loneliness lurking in their depths. She knew the road, knew its ruthless demands. Coming right up, she responded, her voice measured. She filled a sturdy ceramic mug, built to withstand life on the road. She offered neither sugar nor cream, sensing his preference for purity. He accepted the mug, his calloused hands closing around its warmth. He inhaled the steam, closing his eyes in momentary bliss. Good coffee, he conceded, his tone softening slightly. Thank you, Mac replied. He stood for a moment, sipping, his gaze lost in the distant horizon. Silence stretched between them, save for the incessant wail of the wind. Heard they're shutting down the highway tomorrow, he finally said, breaking the quiet. Sandstorms brewing. Yeah, that's the word, Mac confirmed. Gonna be a nasty one. Might be stuck here a while then, he observed, his eyes returning to her. Could be, Mac agreed. Got a room in the back if you need it. Nothing fancy, but it's dry. He nodded slowly. Might just do that. He drained his mug, setting it on the counter, extracting a crumpled bill from his pocket. He laid it down. Keep the change. He offered. He turned and returned to his rig, hauling himself back into the cab. The engine roared to life, the sound echoing across the desolate landscape. A short horn blast signaled his departure as he merged back onto the highway, vanishing into the heat-hazed distance. Mac watched him go, her gaze fixed on the empty road. She knew he'd return, that he would accept her offer. The last stop wasn't merely a coffee stand. It was a sanctuary, a haven for the lost and weary. She wiped the counter, her movements economical, her eyes scanned the sky, noting the darkening clouds amassing on the horizon. The storm was coming, and she needed to be prepared. She moved to the rear, assessing supplies in the compact storage room. She had enough provisions to last several days. She also checked the generator, confirming a full tank. Returning to the front, she secured the door, switching off the lights. She plunged the stand into darkness. Settling at the counter, she stared out the window. The wind howled, assaulting the building. The sandstorm was approaching, bringing an unknown future. Her thoughts drifted to her past, the choices she'd made, the life she had abandoned. She understood that escape was an illusion, but she could still strive to shape her present. She was Maggie Mac Callahan, and this was the last stop. She was the caretaker of this forsaken outpost, the protector of those who sought solace within its walls. She closed her eyes, taking a steady breath. She was ready. Echoes of the past. The knife caught the meager fluorescent light, a predatory glint. Mac passed a honing steel along its length. The gritty scrape a well-worn lullaby, more than a tool for slicing vegetables. The hefty bowie served purposes she'd rather bury deep. The steel snagged, a microburr catching its edge. A jolt, not pain exactly, but recognition, surged through her. Asterisk. Grit. Suffocating, abrasive grit. The retreating thunder of engines, boots crunching on shale. Her breath. A vaporous ghost in the frigid air. He was a mountain of muscle, etched with scars. His fist, a swift hammer, aimed at her temple. She evaded, the displaced air tickling her ear. The coppery tang of blood, immediate and potent, bloomed on her tongue. A harsh, exultant sound spilled from his throat. She simply reacted. Asterisk. Mac blinked, the mundane reality of the coffee stand solidifying around her. The steel felt inert in her grip. She hadn't even registered the pause. The blade remained disappointingly dull. She wiped moisture from the pane, scanning the churning dust devils pirouetting across the parched asphalt. Not here, not again. She resumed sharpening, jaw clenched. The gritty rasp became a conscious anchor, a grounding mantra. Each stroke, a deliberate rejection of the specters nipping at her heels. A sharp crack from outside sent a tremor through her. Not gunfire, probably just another loose piece of the porch succumbing to the wind. But instinct propelled her hand toward the hidden recess beneath the counter. There, it hovered, inches from the latch. Air thinned in her lungs, senses amplifying, pupils shrinking to pinpricks. Years of ingrained response eclipsed the fragile artifice of her new life. Silence stretched. Only the keening wind. Slowly, she lowered her hand, her heart a frantic drum solo against her ribs. Damn it all, that it was always there, simmering just beneath the surface, a dormant predator, waiting to be roused. This wasn't meant to be her reality anymore. She forced a long, deliberate inhale, drawing in the stale, coffee-infused air of the last stop. A scent of normalcy. A stark contrast to the memories threatening to drown her. A glance at the scarred mirror above the counter revealed a road-worn woman, her eyes the color of a storm cloud. Lines fanning from her mouth spoke of terse exchanges and unspoken suffering. Was that truly her reflection? The wraith of a warrior flickered within those eyes, tempered now by profound fatigue. The fighter she once was would have welcomed the fray, thrived on the raw energy of conflict. Now she craved only solitude. But the past, she knew with grim certainty, possessed a relentless homing instinct. She grabbed a soiled cloth and attacked the counter, scrubbing with unnecessary force. The astringent tang of disinfectant filled the confined space, a futile attempt at antiseptic purity, a scrubbing away of the invisible residue of her former life. The radio sputtered to life, interrupting her bleak reverie as a monotonous voice recited the weather report, forecasting escalating winds and plummeting visibility. The sandstorm bore down, and it was closing fast. She confirmed the supplies, a ritual etched into her bones. Canned provisions stacked neatly on shelving, water containers lining the wall, blankets folded and accessible. The last stop transcended its identity as a mere coffee stand. It was a haven, a refuge in a desolate world. She thought of Razor. He'd be pushing the limits to reach her before the storm's full fury descended. He understood the significance of this place, not just as protection from the elements, but as a symbol of hope for something better. She willed him to arrive safely. She noted the clock point 3 hours until dusk. The storm's peak would likely coincide. Time remained. Time to fortify, time to brace herself, but prepare for what exactly? The tempest raging outside, or the echoes of the past threatening to engulf her completely? She retrieved the knife, turning it over in calloused hands. That it was a tool, devoid of inherent morality, a tool capable of construction or destruction. Its purpose defined solely by the hand that commanded it. She recalled another blade, smaller, lighter, but just as lethal. A gift, of sorts. An emblem of what precisely? Allegiance, submission, domination? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk, a cramped, poorly illuminated space. The air thick with the residue of cigarette smoke and the cloying scent of cheap liquor. He loomed before her. His features lost in shadow. A gleaming stiletto danced in his grasp. He presented it to her, hilt extended. "Prove your worth," he rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Prove you deserve to be here." Her hand trembled as she accepted the knife. The cold, substantial weight settled in her palm. She knew the unspoken demand. She knew what she was expected to do. Asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Mac shuddered, the memory of frigid presence in the close confines of the shack. She'd navigated the treacherous path, she'd persevered, but at what devastating cost? Her gaze fixed on the bowie, perceiving not merely a weapon, but a mirror reflecting her own wounded spirit. Could she ever genuinely outrun the shadows clinging to her? Could she ever attain true liberation? The wind screamed again, assaulting the windows of the last stop. The storm intensified, both external and internal. Her grip tightened on the knife, grim resolve hardening her features. She would confront it. She would confront the storm. She would confront the past. She would endure, because she must, for herself, for Razor, for the ember of hope flickering within her. However frail, she returned the knife to its sheath. The locking click a sharp, decisive punctuation mark. She pivoted away from the mirror, refusing to meet the haunted gaze of her former self. That iteration was gone. Shed like an old skin. She was evolving, transforming. Or at least, desperately attempting to. She crossed to the window, peering into the swirling vortex. The external world dissolved into a chaotic ballet of airborne sand. But within the protective shell of the last stop, a semblance of order persisted. A fragile beacon in the encroaching gloom. She would safeguard that light. She would nurture it. She would fight for its survival with every last breath. The storm descended, and she was as prepared as she could be. Iron serpents on the horizon. Max secured the last thermos, the snap of its lid cutting through the sudden hush. The air hung thick, charged with the static of an approaching dust storm. Even the desert's denizens seemed to anticipate the coming onslaught. She buffed the already gleaming countertop, each movement a study in efficiency. The sky outside had adopted a jaundiced hue, and the breeze, though still gentle, carried a grainy bite. She shot a glance at Razor, engrossed in polishing his already immaculate motorcycle, a meditative act to soothe his restless spirit. He met her gaze, offering a pinched smile, worry lines around his eyes now deeply etched canyons like her. He understood the sandstorm was merely one menace gathering on the horizon. The first tremor, a subterranean grumble, could have been mistaken for distant thunder. a prelude to the natural tempest. But Mac recognized the guttural growl of powerful engines, approaching fast. Dropping the rag, she straightened, senses on high alert. Razor froze, wrench poised, head tilted. "Hear that?" "Yeah," she replied, her voice even, the rumble amplified into a raw, visceral roar that resonated through the last stop's foundation. It spoke of unrestrained might, of blatant disregard. A storm far more perilous than swirling grit. Razor cursed, the wrench clattering against metal. His gaze locked with Mac's, a shared grim understanding in their eyes. "Iron Serpents." She nodded, her hand instinctively drifting toward the hidden compartment beneath the counter. Not for a weapon, but for a reinforced steel plate to shield the window, a paltry defense, yet better than nothing. The roar crescendoed, deafening now. Headlights knifed through the ochre gloom, growing larger, nearer. Mac felt the vibrations in her core. A primal warning. She'd hoped they'd stay away, at least for a while longer. Hope, she knew, was a currency she couldn't afford. The lead bike exploded. Into view, a chrome and steel leviathan, trailed by another, and then another. They flooded the last stop's dusty apron. A predatory swarm of metal and menace. 10, 12, 15, Mac lost count. Each machine was a bespoke extension of its rider's character, or lack thereof. Skulls leered from handlebars, serpentine images adorned fuel tanks, and chains coiled around exhaust pipes. It was a calculated display of dominance, an open declaration of war. Dust mushroomed, momentarily obscuring everything, then settled, revealing the Iron Serpents in all their brutish glory. They were a ragged assembly of hard visages and harder physiques. Swathed in leather, inked, and scarred, they radiated an aura of violence and disregard for law. Gina, who had been fiddling with the espresso machine in the back, emerged, wiping her hands. Her eyes widened at the sight, but her expression remained staunch. She stood shoulder to shoulder with Mac, a silent pledge of allegiance. The riders killed their engines, the sudden silence amplifying the palpable tension. The air thrummed with unspoken threats. The lead biker dismounted with affected ease, his movements measured, calculated for maximum intimidation. A mountain of a man, draped in black leather, his face obscured by a bandana. But Mac knew him. Viper. He peeled off his gloves, his gaze raking over the last stop, lingering on Mac, then Razor, then Gina. A cruel smile twisted his lips, boots crunching on gravel, each step a deliberate act of aggression. He approached the counter. Well, he rumbled, his voice a low growl that echoed the departing engines. The last stop. How picturesque. He spat, a gesture both casual and overtly hostile. Mac didn't flinch. Her gaze met his, cold and steady. "What do you want, Viper?" He chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down Gina's spine. "Is that any way to greet an old comrade? Heard you'd set up shop in the sticks. Thought I'd drop by. See how the mighty have relocated." "I haven't relocated," Max stated, her voice unwavering. "I've just moved on." "Moved on?" Viper arched a brow, amusement glinting in his eyes. "From what? Killing? Deceit? Theft? Those aren't skills you discard, Maggie. They're etched in your bones." He closed the distance, leaning on the counter, invading her personal space. His presence was suffocating, a stark reminder of a past she'd fought tooth and nail to bury. "You always had a knack for it, Maggie. The best. A waste to see you reduced to serving Joe." "I'm not Maggie anymore," she said, her voice a low threat. "I'm Mac." Viper laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Mac? Pitiful. Change the name, change the place, but you can't change the soul. You're one of us, Maggie. Always will be." He gestured to his crew, who had now dismounted and were fanning out, their eyes darting about, hands hovering near their weapons like carrion birds, circling their prize. Gina stepped forward, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Get off our property, Viper. We don't want any trouble." Viper turned his attention to her, his smile widening into a leer. And who might you be, sweetheart? One of Maggie's rejects. You look like you know your way around an engine. He paused, appraising her with a gaze that made her recoil. Maybe you should come back with us. Daldat we could use a grease monkey like you. Gina's fist clenched, but before she could retaliate, Razor interposed himself between her and Viper, taller than Viper, but lacking the man's raw, predatory energy. Leave her alone, Viper, Razor said, his voice surprisingly firm. She's got nothing to do with any of this. Viper's eyes narrowed to slits. Razor, ever the hero, always defending the weak. You always were spineless. He spat again, the glob landing uncomfortably close to Razor's boots. You know, I always wondered what she saw in you. Never strong enough, never brutal enough, destined to be bottom rung. Razor's jaw tightened, but he stood his ground. I want nothing to do with you anymore. Viper. I'm done with the serpents. Done? Viper chuckled. You don't just walk away from the serpents. Razor. It's a lifetime commitment. Blood in, blood out. You know the code. He turned back to Mac, his eyes gleaming with malice. But perhaps, just perhaps, there's a way for you to earn your release. A small task, a little offering. A way to prove you haven't gone soft. To show us you're still one of us. The wind howled, a mournful lament that underscored Viper's words. The sandstorm was drawing near, and with it, the Iron Serpents. Mac knew that whatever Viper wanted, it reeked of trouble. A test, a trial, an attempt to drag her back into the darkness she'd fought so fiercely to escape, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the real battle had only just begun, testing the waters. A film of grit hazed the windows, dimming the already weak afternoon light. Maggie wiped the counter, the rag snagging on a stray granule. Behind her, the espresso machine sighed steam, a comforting thrum against the rising wind outside. Viper's crew lounged by their bikes, chrome glinting faintly beneath the dust. He remained fixed, a dark figure plastered against the last stop's faded sign like a parasitic growth. Maggie drew herself a coffee, its pungent aroma a small act of defiance against the brooding atmosphere. She sipped, her gaze level on Viper. He was menace personified, decked in scarred leather and gleaming metal. His face a roadmap of past violence and current arrogance. He levered himself off the sign, which creaked in protest. Well, he drawled, ambling toward the counter. Look what the desert blew in. Little Miss Mac, playing shopkeeper. He gestured around the cramped space with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Doesn't exactly scream bruiser, does it? Maggie didn't so much as blink. Her eyes, cool and watchful, met his. It screams good coffee to those with the taste for it. Viper chuckled, a sound like gravel shifting. Coffee? You traded in broken bones for roasted beans? What a waste, Mac. You had a knack. A real talent for convincing people. He edged closer, invading her space. The air grew heavy with the reek of gasoline and cheap cologne. This little retreat must get lonely. A looker like you, all by yourself. His eyes lingered on her, a slow, insolent appraisal. Bet you missed the action. Maggie placed her mug down, the ceramic making a soft click. I find the peace quite welcome. Peace? You call this peace? Just wait till the squall hits. Then you'll know silence. Or maybe you'll crave the company of folks who know how to raise hell. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a husky murmur. Maybe I could show you. Maggie offered no response, no spark of reaction. She simply held his stare, her expression an impenetrable mask. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the mounting shriek of the wind. One of the bikers, a mountainous man with a shaved head and a web of ink crawling up his neck, shifted his weight. He cleared his throat. A low rumble. Viper shot him a glance, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He straightened, stepping back from the counter. All right, he said, his voice regaining its swagger. No need to get your chains in a knot. Just admiring the view. He winked, a gesture more threatening than flirtatious. The view prefers to be admired from afar. Maggie countered, her voice smooth as polished stone. Viper's smile thinned. He was used to provoking a reaction, to seeing fear bloom in people's eyes. Maggie's implacable calm was clearly grating on him. He shifted his approach. "So, Razor," he remarked, his tone almost casual, "still hiding in the back. Tell him Viper sends his love. And remind him about that little agreement he made." He paused. The words left to fester in the air. An agreement's an agreement, Mac. Especially when it's with the Iron Serpents. Maggie's eyes narrowed, a brief flash of concern piercing her placid facade. She knew the promise Razor had made. She understood the price he had paid for a chance at a new life. "Razor's not here," she stated, her voice devoid of inflection, a lie. Viper arched a brow, a smirk playing on his lips. "Oh. Well, I guess we'll just have to wait for him, then, won't we? We're not going anywhere. The storm's brewing, and this charming little place looks like the only haven for miles." He glanced at his crew, who were watching the exchange with a blend of trepidation and ghoulish fascination. "Boys, settle in. Looks like it's going to be a long night." He turned back to Maggie, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "Maybe you can enlighten me on how you managed to tame our little stray. Razor was always a wild one. What's your secret, Mac? Or is it something you whisper only in his ear?" The insinuation hung heavy in the air, a noxious cloud. Maggie gripped the counter's edge, her knuckles bone-white. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass. The storm was bearing down, bringing with it the full force of Viper's implied threat. She took a deep breath, forcing a semblance of composure. She wouldn't grant him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. "Razor made his choices," she said, her voice even. "He's a free man, and I intend to keep him that way." Viper's laugh was a harsh, abrupt sound. "Free? Nobody's ever truly free from the serpents. Mac. We're a family, and family always comes first." He leaned in again, his breath a hot, unwelcome presence on her face. "You think you can shield him from us? You're playing a fool's game, sweetheart." Maggie didn't yield. She met his gaze, her eyes burning with defiance. "Try me." The silence descended again, thicker and more menacing than before. The other bikers watched, their faces etched with grim anticipation. They knew Maggie. They knew her capabilities. They also knew Viper's inherent cruelty. The air thrummed with unspoken tension. Finally, Viper straightened, a flicker of doubt in his expression. He had baited her, poked at her, tried to intimidate her. And she hadn't cracked. He hadn't anticipated such resistance. He raked a hand through his slicked back hair, his smile faltering. "All right, Mac," he conceded, his voice losing its sharp edge. "You win. For now. But don't think this is over. This is only the prelude." He spun around and stalked back towards his bike, his movements less assured that he signaled to his crew, and they reluctantly followed, their eyes lingering on Maggie as they departed. The storm unleashed its fury as they huddled around a meager bonfire. A swirling chaos of sand and howling wind. Maggie watched them through the streaked windows, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had stood firm, but she knew this was a temporary reprieve. Viper wouldn't relinquish his hold easily. The real ordeal was still to come. A hand in the till. The wind keened like a banshee outside, buffeting the cafe windows. Maggie swiped at the spotless countertop, the repetitive action a small rebellion against the encroaching dread, both atmospheric and internal. Razor was supposedly fixing the generator in the back, but she knew he was battling his own demons. Viper's shadow hung heavy, and no blame there. The Iron Serpents lounged throughout the diner, a predatory pack poised to descend. Viper occupied a booth near the glass, nursing a beer and pinning Maggie with a gaze that felt like an invasive probe. His eyes, obsidian shards, held no warmth. The very air thrummed with menace. One of the figures detached himself. Knuckles, an apt moniker, gnarled and scarred. His hands spoke of a brutal history of forced compliance. He swaggered toward the counter, a greasy smirk plastered across his face. "Coffee tastes like dishwater," he rasped, crowding Maggie, his bulk invading her space. Needs a little encouragement. He jerked his chin at the tip jar, a squat glass container holding a motley collection of currency. Some seed money. Maggie met his gaze, her face a mask of composure. It's strong enough for those who earn their keep, she countered, her voice even but edged with steel at a gauntlet thrown. Knuckles emitted a dry, grating laugh. Honest? Sweetheart, you wouldn't recognize it if it introduced itself. His eyes lingered on her hands, strong and capable, a telling contrast to his ham-fisted paws. But generosity is my middle name. I'm feeling philanthropic. Maggie's senses sharpened, every nerve on high alert. The tempest outside mirrored the volatile tension brewing within the confines of the cafe. She knew what was coming. A primal awareness bloomed in her, a feeling long dormant, yet never truly extinguished. She turned to the vintage espresso machine, its chrome surfaces reflecting the dim light. Methodically, she began the ritual of grinding and tamping, the familiar sounds a defiant rhythm against the suffocating silence. Knuckles shifted, his gaze flitting around, assessing his comrades. Viper remained a still, silent presence. The other bikers watched with a blend of anticipation and crude amusement as Maggie reached for the steaming milk. Knuckles pounced. His hand darted out, a blur of violence aimed for the tip jar. Time seemed to decelerate. Maggie perceived the movement with hyperclarity, each detail etched into her mind. The avarice in Knuckles' eyes, the barely perceptible tremble in his reaching hand. The minute shift in Viper's stance without a word, without hesitation. Maggie responded. A dance ingrained in her muscle memory. A brutal ballet practiced in a past life. She needed no weapon. Instead of grasping the milk, Maggie spun. Her body a coiled spring unleashed. Her left hand lashed out, not for his hand, but for his wrist. Her grip tightened with surprising force, an unyielding clamp. In the same fluid movement, she exploited his momentum. She stepped behind him, hooking her ankle behind his leg at a deft shift of weight, a precise application of leverage, and Knuckles was destabilized. He grunted, a sound of shock and pain. As his wrist contorted at an unnatural angle, the tip jar wobbled precariously, threatening to spill its meager contents before he could recover. Maggie completed the takedown with a swift, controlled motion. She used his own bulk against him. Executing a perfect throw, he sailed through the air, a flailing mass, and slammed into a nearby table, sending chairs sprawling. The cafe exploded. The Iron Serpents lurched to their feet, their faces stunned and disbelieving. Viper remained seated, his expression enigmatic, though a spark of something dangerous now flickered in his eyes. Knuckles lay prone, struggling to breathe, his wrist screaming. He glared up at Maggie, his face twisted with fury and humiliation. You'll regret this, you old hag. Maggie stood behind the counter, radiating an unsettling calm, her eyes glacial. She hadn't even broken a sweat. The espresso machine hissed, a plume of vapor rising like a ghostly signal. I suggest you reconsider who's going to be paying, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Because you're in my establishment, and you're violating my rules. The other bikers hesitated, uncertain how to proceed. They were masters of intimidation, of overwhelming force, of numerical advantage. They were unprepared for someone who possessed such speed, such precision, such chilling composure. Viper finally broke the silence, his voice a low rumble. Impressive, he conceded, his gaze locked on Maggie. I underestimated you, old woman. Maggie didn't so much as blink. There's a lot you don't know, she said, and plenty you're about to discover. He tented his fingers, his eyes unwavering. Perhaps, he said, but I always get what I want. And right now I want Razor. The wind wailed outside, a mournful lament. Grit lashed against the windows, blurring the already fading daylight. The storm was closing in, both beyond the walls and inside her heart. Maggie understood that this was just the overture. The rules had shifted, the stakes were higher, and she was prepared to play. The peaceful existence she had painstakingly constructed was about to be tested in ways she had hoped to avoid. Yet, if it meant safeguarding Razor, Preserving her sanctuary, she would unleash the wraith she had believed was long gone. The specter they once knew as Mac. The challenge. Viper's face, a topography etched with hardship and malice, twisted further. The air vibrated with his barely leashed anger as he lashed out. His boot connecting with Knuckles' abandoned chair that he spun across the scarred floor, the sharp report echoing in the suffocating hush that had descended, thicker than the desert dust sifting through the window seams. You let yourself get hustled by a two-bit waitress. Viper hissed, the venom directed at Knuckles, who cradled his injured hand, eyes fixed on the floor in shame. You humiliate me in front of this. A dismissive flick of his wrist encompassed Maggie. That this hung like a foul odor. Maggie remained still, hands poised on the counter, her gaze unwavering outside. The rising tempest mirrored the one gathering within her, the tang of ozone. A metallic prickle heralded potential violence more acutely than the aroma of her coffee razor, lingering near the kitchen entrance, edged forward, then froze. His gaze shuttling between Viper and Maggie. Viper's rages were legendary. He'd witnessed their destructive power firsthand. Viper, maybe we can just... Razor's voice trailed off, barely audible. Viper's glare, sharp enough to cleave stone, silenced him. Shut it, Razor. This is between me and the staff. Turning back to Maggie, his gaze narrowed with predatory intent. Think you're clever, huh? Think you can embarrass my crew and walk away? Her silence was a bulwark, unyielding and unnerving. She understood his game, that he craved a reaction, a slip-up that would justify his fury. I defended myself, she stated, her tone level and calm, a stark contrast to Viper's simmering ire. He instigated it. He was settling accounts. Viper growled, each word a poison dart. Accounts you now inherit. Razor's under my thumb. What he earns, what he owns, it's mine, and you meddled. Razor is his own person, Maggie countered, her voice even, yet edged with steel. He works here, earns a fair wage. Viper barked out a mirthless laugh. Free? Nobody gets out of here free, sweetheart. Especially not Razor. He's indebted to me. Deeply. He closed the distance, his face inches from hers, but she didn't flinch. Perhaps there's a way to resolve this. A way for you to settle Razor's debt. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threats, punctuated only by the wind's mournful howl against the grimy windows. The cafe felt like a bomb waiting to detonate. I propose a contest, Viper declared, his voice a low rumble, a test of strength. Winner takes all. If you prevail, Razor walks. Clean slate, no strings if I do. He left the implication hanging, a dark cloud. Both of you become my property. You'll dance to my tune, learn the cost of tangling with the Iron Serpents. He straightened, malice glinting in his eyes, and indicated a scarred table in the corner. Here. Now. Let's see what you're really made of, girly. The challenge dropped like a lead weight. Razor's breath hitched. He understood Viper's capacity for violence, the ease with which he inflicted pain. He looked at Maggie, pleading with her silently to refuse. He dreaded her becoming another casualty of the Iron Serpents. Maggie's gaze met Razor's, her expression inscrutable. She saw his fear, his desperation, but also a fragile ember of hope. That he had faith in her. Turning to Viper, her gaze unflinching, she saw arrogance, the confidence bred from years of dominance, but she also detected a core of insecurity, a dread of being challenged, proven fallible. A slow smile blossomed on Maggie's face, one that didn't touch her eyes. It was a dangerous smile, a hint of the darkness concealed beneath her placid facade. I accept, she responded, her voice quiet yet resolute. But let's sweeten the pot. Viper's brow furrowed. He hadn't anticipated her accepting, let alone attempting to renegotiate. What are you suggesting? If I am victorious, Maggie said, her eyes boring into Viper's. Razor is liberated, and every serpent who craves release gets no reprisal. No looking back. A murmur rippled through the serpents still present. Nervous glances were exchanged. Maggie's proposition was a beacon, A chance to escape the shackles of their existence. Viper's face darkened. He recognized the spark of longing, the yearning for a different life. He couldn't permit that to spread. It would erode his power, loosen his grip. You're delusional, he spat. I'd never consent to that. Then you're afraid, Maggie taunted, her voice dripping with scorn. Afraid your followers might choose freedom over fealty. Afraid to cede command. Her words struck true. Viper's face flushed. He couldn't retreat now. Not before his men. Not before this woman. Fine, he snarled. You triumph, your terms stand. But if I do, he paused, letting the menace linger. You become mine. You'll do my bidding, whenever, wherever, and Razor will witness it. Maggie gave a slow nod, her gaze unwavering. Agreed. The air crackled, charged. The battered table became ground zero. Razor stood paralyzed. His heart a frantic drum, he braced for the unknown. Maggie moved from behind the counter, her movements fluid, cat-like. She approached the table, her eyes fixed on Viper. The sandstorm outside echoed the tempest about to erupt within. As Maggie neared the table, she rolled up the sleeves of her worn denim shirt, revealing forearms surprisingly defined for a coffee slinger. The gesture was deliberate, a quiet display of strength. He watched her, a mix of apprehension and raw desire swirling within him. He had underestimated her, dismissed her as a simple barista. Now he saw the steel, the grit. He knew he was in for a struggle. He couldn't falter. He had issued a challenge, and he must stand by it. He needed to reassert his dominance. He would break her, bend her to his will. He sat, his gaze locked on Maggie. He flexed his hand, feeling the coiled power. He was confident. He was strong. Victory would be his. Maggie sat opposite him, her gaze unwavering. She placed her elbow on the table, her hand extended. The touch was cool, steady. Their hands locked. The grip was firm, implacable. The contest had begun. Ghosts of Kandahar. The desert wind, a banshee wail against the last stop diner's tin roof, threatened to strip the paint from the walls. Maggie scrubbed at the counter. The astringent odor of cleanser a flimsy barrier against the encroaching grit. Outside, the sandstorm massed, a ravenous ochre tide ready to engulf everything. She checked the chronometer above the percolator. Any second now. The door chime, a frail tinkle drowned by the gale, announced a visitor. A figure, coated in grime, stumbled inside and slumped into a booth. Maggie watched as motes settled around the newcomer like a shroud. It was Razor. Tough night? She inquired, nudging a steaming mug across the scarred formica. He grunted, collapsing against the worn vinyl. Tough is an understatement, Mac. He gulped the coffee, the warmth seeming to thaw him from the inside. Maggie leaned back, arms crossed. Razor was a decent kid, or trying to be. That made him vulnerable, and vulnerability was a death sentence. The wind buffeted the windows, a sound that yanked her back, across years, across continents. Kandahar. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Afghan valley reeked of burnt fuel and raw terror. Mac. Then Lieutenant Callahan, huddled behind a crumbling mud partition, dust needling her eyes. The firefight had spiraled for hours. A brutal ballet of lead and detonations. Her Special Forces unit, tasked with extracting a high-value target, was trapped. RPG incoming! Sergeant Miller's voice cracked with alarm. Reacting on instinct, Mac shoved Miller earthward just as the rocket slammed into the wall, sending a rain of debris. The blast robbed her of hearing, the world dissolving into a vortex of swirling dust and searing pain as the ringing faded. She scrambled up, hacking. Miller groaned, clutching his leg. Alive. That was what mattered. Status report, she barked, voice roughened. Taking fire. Lieutenant Jackson, their medic, reported. Target secure, but the perimeter's breached. Mac assessed the situation. A sizable contingent of Taliban fighters, well-armed, encircled them. Their sole option was a breakout to the extraction point. All right, listen up, she commanded, her tone even despite the adrenaline surge. Jackson, tend to Miller, Davis Garcia, with me. We're creating a diversion. Miller, once Jackson patches you, lay down suppressing fire. Let's go. Max spearheaded the charge. Her M for spitting lead, years of honed reflexes flowed into action. She'd witnessed sights, committed deeds, that would haunt most. She suppressed it, compartmentalized it, focusing solely on the objective. They blasted through the enemy, a tempest of calculated force. Mac moved like quicksilver, anticipating every feint, every threat. She neutralized 3 insurgents in rapid succession, her motions fluid and lethal. A weapon, forged in the crucible of combat. They reached the designated clearing, where a Black Hawk waited. But as they closed in, Mac spotted something that froze her blood. A figure materialized from the shadows, a man in American uniform. Captain Hayes, their commanding officer. He leveled his sidearm, not at the enemy, but at the helicopter pilot. "Stand down," Hayes bellowed, his voice edged with madness. "Mission compromised, I repeat, stand down." Max stared, stunned. Hayes was one of them, a brother in arms, but his eyes betrayed a far darker truth. He was a turncoat. "Hayes, what the hell are you doing?" she demanded, her voice laced with disbelief. He turned, his eyes gleaming with manic intensity. "Securing our future, Lieutenant. This target holds more value alive to certain individuals than dead. Consider this a tutorial in realpolitik." Mac lunged, but too late. Hayes fired, the bullet finding its mark in the pilot's head. The Black Hawk convulsed and pancaked in a fiery inferno. The remaining Taliban pounced, sensing weakness. Mac fought with savage desperation, but they were overwhelmingly outnumbered. She watched her comrades fall, their sacrifices rendered meaningless by Hayes' treachery. Miller crumpled, Jackson, 2, Davis, Garcia, all gone. She managed to fell Hayes before being overrun. But as she stood over his corpse, surrounded by slaughter, despair threatened to drown her. What was the point? What was the point of any of it if it culminated in this? Greed, betrayal, senseless oblivion. She had dedicated her life to her country, to protecting the defenseless, only to unearth corruption and disillusionment. As she bandaged a laceration on her arm, she realized she was finished. She couldn't endure it anymore. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. This sandstorm was tame compared to Kandahar, she mused, her gaze glued to Razor. The diner's panes shuddered. She had abandoned the military, melted into the shadows. She'd cast off her identity, her history, like discarded skin. She became Maggie, a wraith, flitting between towns, always watchful. She had sought respite, a semblance of normalcy. But the specters, the phantoms of Kandahar, persisted in haunting her. And now they loomed again, threatening to drag her back into the abyss. She looked at Razor, his face etched with worry. Just a kid, trying to outrun a violent past. He deserved a chance. And she, against her better judgment, was determined to grant it. "We're about to have company," she said, her voice low and resolute. "Viper won't let this drop. He's coming for you." Razor blanched. "What do we do, Mac?" Maggie reached beneath the counter and retrieved a scarred shotgun. The metallic snick as she chambered a round echoed in the sudden quiet. "We fight," she declared, her eyes hardening. "We show them some ghosts are best left undisturbed." The sandstorm howled, mirroring the tempest raging within her. The echoes of Kandahar stirred, demanding recognition, and this time, she wouldn't flee. She would stand fast and retaliate, for Razor, for herself, for a shot at absolution. The arm wrestle. The diner air grew heavy, not just with the crimson dust clouding the grimy windows, but with a different sort of weight. An unspoken dare, a potent musk of testosterone eclipsing even the stale coffee. Viper, the Iron Serpents muscle, popped his knuckles, the sharp cracks slicing through the sudden quiet. His challenge needed no words. Gina, scrubbing the counter with furious energy, flicked a glance towards Maggie at a silent plea. "You don't have to." But also a promise. "I'm right here." Maggie met her friend's eyes, a hint of thankfulness flickering within. Gina understood. This wasn't merely about Razor, the greasy spoon, or even the serpent's swaggering presence. It scraped at old wounds, at battles left unfinished. This ridiculous arm wrestle was a stand-in for all of it. All right. Maggie's voice, even and firm, knifed through the thick tension. Let's get this over with. Viper's grin flashed, yellow teeth briefly exposed. Now you're talking, dollface. A primal urge for spectacle seized the bikers. Tables scraped as they cleared a space in the center of the room. The formica top becoming center stage. Dust devils pirouette in the lone sunbeam cutting through the gloom, spotlighting this bizarre contest. Maggie moved toward the makeshift arena. Betraying none of the apprehension churning inside, she dragged a chair forward, its metal legs screeching against the worn linoleum. Viper's immense frame swallowed the chair he occupied. He reeked of motor, oil, flat beer, and something else. A sharp, metallic tang that dredged up unwelcome memories of Kandahar. The other serpents formed a rough ring, their faces a canvas of anticipation and barely concealed disdain. Gina stayed planted behind the counter, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. She wouldn't let them get away with a thing. Viper's elbow slammed onto the table, a jarring thud that rattled the silverware. Ready to cry, uncle, little lady? Maggie planted her elbow across from his, the cool table surface a minor comfort against the surge of heat within. She ignored his baiting, grounding herself in the present. She focused on the table's texture against her skin, the reassuring weight of her arm. She'd need more than brawn to win this. Leverage, strategy, was all that stood between her and humiliating defeat. Their hands clasped. Viper's was a meaty vice, calloused and slick with unexpected sweat. Maggie's, smaller but resolute, offered an unyielding grip. She felt the coiled power within him, the raw, untamed force he so clearly relished. A taut silence descended. Even the wind seemed to pause for breath. Go! Someone bellowed from the crowd. Viper detonated, surging forward with every ounce of his weight. Maggie's arm buckled instantly, the pressure a brutal assault. She gritted her teeth, her muscles screaming in protest. Sweat bloomed on her brow. He was monstrously strong, more so than she'd calculated. Her angle was off, she was losing ground, and fast. A wave of jeers washed over her from the biker pack. Gina's face was a rigid mask of worry. Maggie dug in her heels, battling the relentless downward pressure. She shifted, searching for a more defensible stance, every fiber of her being strained. The pain was a searing blaze, but surrender wasn't an option. Not now. Not ever. Viper roared, a primitive sound of exertion and impending victory. He tasted triumph. He bore down, his face contorted, saliva spraying from his lips. Maggie's arm quivered violently, nearing the table's surface, her resolve frayed, a familiar darkness beckoning. But then her gaze locked with Gina's, the unwavering faith in those eyes igniting a spark of rebellion. She couldn't overpower him. She had to outsmart him. Exploit his hubris. The unexpected, with a surge of desperation. Maggie subtly rotated her wrist, adjusting their connection point. At a minuscule alteration, almost invisible, but enough. She felt Viper's onslaught falter. A hair's breadth of a second. Capitalizing on that sliver of weakness, she leveraged her weight, pushing back against his momentum. Not to win. Not yet. Just to endure. To keep a foothold in the contest. The jeers morphed into mutters of surprise. Viper's grin evaporated, replaced by a bewildered scowl. He couldn't fathom her tenacity. Maggie continued to resist, her arm burning, her lungs laboring. She was playing the long game, seeking an advantage, waiting for him to overextend. The dust storm outside intensified, the wind clawing at the diner's walls. The flickering light threw elongated, grotesque shadows across the room. The arm wrestling match had transcended a simple contest of strength, morphing into a battle of wills, a silent war between two adversaries locked in a desperate dance. She detected a change in Viper's tempo. His grip remained fierce, but his movements lacked their initial finesse. His actions were now raw, unrefined aggression. He was banking everything on brute force, neglecting strategy. Here came her chance. With a jolt of adrenaline, Maggie tweaked her weight once more, unbalancing Viper ever so slightly. A risky gamble. But her only shot. A pang shot through her muscles, but she suppressed it. She couldn't lose focus now. Viper recoiled from the table. A microfracture, yet big enough to change their story. Maggie grabbed hold of the opening. She spun her wrist again, extracting maximum benefit from her fulcrum. She felt Viper's arm shake and watched as his imposing power waned. The bikers whispered amongst themselves. The waitress was still in it. The wind howled, the diner groaned, and the two adversaries remained fused in their intense drama, their faces reflecting resolve. The outcome was uncertain, but what was now perfectly clear was that Maggie Callahan wasn't going away so easily. For the first time, Viper questioned his assessment of his rival. A dirty trick. Viper's arm throbbed, the frantic buzz rippling into Maggie's grip. She felt it surge up his bicep. A stark admission of the duress he endured. Perspiration slicked his brow, reflecting the harsh fluorescent hum of the diner. His knuckles, bleached white, strained against the cheap laminate surface. She answered the pressure, slow and measured, feeling the fulcrum shift. A wave of murmurs washed through the onlookers. Even the serpents' grim visages betrayed a flash of shock. Gina, propped against the counter, offered a nearly invisible affirmation, her eyes reflecting a fierce, silent encouragement. Maggie drank it in, a quiet wellspring against the encroaching darkness of her past. Viper's breath caught in his throat. He snarled, lips peeling back from his teeth. Maggie met his gaze, unflinching. A strange stillness settled over her, a detached clarity she hadn't known in years. The eye of the storm, the silence before the lethal strike. Except this time, death wasn't the endgame. It was liberation. She cranked up the pressure. Viper's arms spasmed violently. She spied a flicker of panic in his eyes, a wild scramble for purchase. The angle opened further, his wrist bending inexorably toward the table. Victory shimmered within reach. Then, a subtle change. A near imperceptible tightening of his shoulder. Unrelated to the arm wrestling itself. A cold hand clenched around Maggie's gut. Something else entirely. Years of ruthless training shrieked a warning. He was playing dirty. Her gaze dipped for a heartbeat. A silver glint, mirroring the diner's buzzing lights, snaked within the leather of his jacket sleeve. A slender, vicious blade was easing down towards his wrist. He aimed to sever the tendons in her hand. A swift, brutal severing to end the match. A stark lesson delivered. Rage, glacial and sharp, supplanted the fury of old. This wasn't about pride or ego. This was about defending the fragile sanctuary she'd fought so hard to build. Time stretched. She eased her pressure incrementally, offering Viper the mirage of regained dominance. Triumphant fire flared in his eyes. He'd taken the bait. Idiot. As the blade neared his wrist, poised to maim, Maggie moved. Her reaction blurred. A flicker too fast for most to register. She didn't release. Instead, she weaponized his momentum. A deft shift of weight, almost undetectable, yanked him forward, unbalancing him. His already strained arm buckled under the sudden, jarring shift. The blade meant for her now menaced him. He recoiled instinctively, grip faltering. It was all she required. With blinding speed, she twisted her wrist, hooking fingers around his broken bones. No lasting damage. Not yet. Instead, she exploited her leverage to force his palm open. The blade clattered onto the table, the sound amplified in the suddenly breathless diner. A stiletto. Its grip-worn leather, cruel light danced across its razor-edged. Collective intake of breath swept the space. The Iron Serpents wore expressions of stunned disbelief, a mixture of shock and outrage. Viper's face, a portrait of humiliation and wrath. Maggie's grip remained locked. She held him fast, gaze locked on his. A cheap shot, Viper, she said, her voice a low, dangerous purr. Expected better. She released him suddenly, shoving him back against the booth. He stumbled, bracing himself on the table. His face burned, hatred blazing in his eyes. "You bitch!" he spat, voice thick with venom. Maggie ignored the outburst, her gaze sweeping the other serpents, a rough assembly, faces etched with hardship, eyes mirroring a blend of fear and resentment. She caught a glimmer of something else, a spark of reluctant respect, perhaps even admiration. "Anyone else feeling lucky?" she asked. Her tone level and unwavering silence reigned. The only sounds were the hum of overhead lights and the distant growl of a truck. The air hung heavy, thick with tension. Razor, who had been a silent sentinel in the corner, moved as he retrieved the blade as he studied it, his expression inscrutable. Then, with a swift snap of his wrist, he broke it in half. He dropped the pieces before Viper. "We don't pull that garbage here," he rumbled, his voice gravelly and low. Viper stared at the remnants of the blade, rage simmering beneath the surface. He knew he'd been humbled, not only by Maggie but by Razor as well. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. He pushed to his feet, eyes never breaking contact with Maggie's. "This isn't over," he growled. "You might have won a skirmish, but the war has just begun." Maggie returned his stare, unflinching. "I'll be waiting," she replied, her voice devoid of all emotion. Viper turned and stalked from the diner, his crew trailing in his wake. The silence that followed roared in its intensity. Gina touched Maggie's shoulder. "You all right?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Maggie nodded. "I'm fine," she stated. "Just drained." She scanned the diner. The remaining patrons stared, faces a blend of awe and apprehension. Her life had irrevocably changed, and no more hiding in the shadows. She had revealed herself, and now she had to deal with what came next. Razor approached, his face grave. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. "You've made things worse." "I didn't have a choice," Maggie responded. "He was going to hurt me. He was going to hurt us all," Gina countered. "Mac did what she had to." Razor sighed. "I know," he said. "But now they'll come after us. They won't let this go unanswered." "Then we'll be ready for them," Maggie declared, her voice resolute. "We'll fight back." She knew the path ahead would be perilous, but fear no longer held her. She had stared down her demons, and she had prevailed. She was prepared to fight for her freedom, for her peace, and for those she held dear. Cracks in the serpent. The echoes of Viper's humbling defeat hadn't quite faded when the descent began. Not a full-throated rebellion, but a simmering unease that resonated through the Iron Serpents like a misfiring engine. Maggie, concealed beneath the shadow of her borrowed hat, observed them with an inscrutable expression. Gina, gearhead Rossi, barely containing her wrath, slammed a wrench against the steel workbench, the reverberation causing several nearby bikers to flinch. A wad of chewing tobacco landed in a nearby can with a resonant thwack, punctuating the sudden hush. That was a crock. Viper, pure and simple. Viper, still smarting from his bruised ego and wrist, scowled. "Mind your tongue, Rossi. Got a problem?" "Damn right, I have a problem," Gina snapped, her voice a tight wire of restraint. "We're supposed to be about strength, about earning respect. Pulling a blade? That's low, even for you." Her gaze swept the assembled serpents, a blatant challenge in her eyes. "Are we going to tolerate this? Are we going to let him drag us all down?" A few heads bobbed in agreement. This wasn't solely about the loss. It was the underhandedness of it. The Iron Serpents, beneath their gruff exteriors and criminal dealings, clung to a skewed sense of honor. Such flagrant dishonesty was a transgression. Razor stepped forward, his face a map of disappointment. He avoided Maggie's gaze, directing his words at Viper. "Viper, I'm surprised. Man. We're supposed to hold ourselves to a higher standard." Viper's features grew darker. "Button it, Razor. Always the bleeding heart. You think she won fair and square? She's hiding something. I'm telling you, something unnatural." "Unnatural?" Gina scoffed. "Or maybe she's just tougher than you, Viper. Maybe you aren't the alpha you think you are." The air crackled with tension, thick as smog. Knuckles, Viper's constant companion, shifted uncomfortably at a behemoth of a man. His face a canvas of scars and hard living. Even he seemed uncertain. He placed a heavy hand on Viper's shoulder, a gesture both supportive and restraining. "Easy there, Viper. Knuckles rumbled, his voice surprisingly mellow despite his size. Let's not make it worse. We've got a rep to think about. He surveyed the other serpents, his gaze a silent warning. Just chill out. Viper, though visibly enraged, seemed to heed Knuckles' counsel, at least for the moment. He shrugged off Knuckles' hand and stomped towards his bike. Every movement a declaration of simmering fury as Viper ignited his engine. The machine's roar almost amplified his rage. He gunned the throttle repeatedly, the noise deafening, before finally peeling out down the highway, leaving behind a plume of dust and lingering resentment. The remaining serpents stood in quiet contemplation, the air heavy with unspoken thoughts. Gina spat again, this time hitting a discarded beer can with unerring precision. Someone had to say it? She muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Razor sighed, raking a hand through his thinning hair. You didn't help matters, Gina. Now he'll just be even more riled up. Maybe riled up is what he needs, Gina retorted, her eyes flashing defiance. Maybe he needs to be taken down a notch or two. This isn't the same crew it used to be. Razor. Some of us are trying to forge something better. Something cleaner. Vipers become a liability. Knuckles watched the exchange with a furrowed brow. He respected Gina, even liked her, but his allegiance to Viper ran deep. They had weathered hell together, seen things that would forever mark a soul. He couldn't simply turn his back on him, not after everything. Gina's got a point, Razor, he said softly, his voice barely cutting through the thrum of idling engines. Viper hasn't been himself lately. He's been pushing the envelope, taking needless risks. He paused, staring down at his calloused hands. But he's still family. We have to try to pull him back, not push him over the edge. Pull him back. Gina laughed, a mirthless, grating sound. He's beyond redemption, Knuckles. He's too far gone. Razor shook his head. We have to try. We owe it to ourselves, to the fading memory of what this gang once represented. He looked at Knuckles, a silent plea in his eyes. Talk to him, Knuckles. Try to get him to see reason. Knuckles nodded slowly, his face etched with worry. I'll try, Razor, but I can't promise miracles. He glanced in the direction Viper had vanished, a deep crease forming on his forehead as the serpents scattered, some muttering amongst themselves, others simply mounting their bikes and roaring off into the twilight. Maggie remained a quiet observer. She had stirred something profound within this gang, something that had lain dormant for years. The cracks in the serpent's tough veneer were widening, and she sensed, with a disquieting certainty, that events were spiraling toward complexity. Razor approached her, his face a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Thanks, Maggie, for, well, Don't thank me, she replied, her voice devoid of emotion. I simply defended myself. Yeah, but you did more than that. You showed them something. You showed them that Viper can be beaten. He hesitated, then added, Be careful, Maggie. He won't let this lie. He'll be coming for you. Maggie met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. I'm counting on it. Gina, passing by, paused and gave Maggie a brief nod. You've got grit, lady, I'll grant you that. She swung onto her own custom-built motorcycle, a machine as brutal and uncompromising as she was. With a final nod, she ignited the engine and sped off, leaving Maggie and Razor alone in the deepening dusk. The air hung heavy with the scent of gasoline and smoldering resentment, a volatile brew that promised future discord. The Iron Serpents weren't broken, not yet, but the seeds of dissension had been sown, and Maggie knew that she, whether she desired it or not, was now ensnared in their tangled web, lines drawn. Razor stood firm, a David facing a Goliath of chrome and fury. Despite his slender build, an indomitable spirit blazed within him. The air, thick with the stench of gasoline and unspoken animosity, vibrated with tension. Refracted light from the diner windows transformed the waiting motorcycles into gleaming, metallic predators. Enough, Viper, Razor declared, his tone unwavering, masking the tremor that threatened to consume him. Gina's right. Your pride has you blinded. Maggie didn't betray the code. You did when you targeted her family. Viper's face, already a canvas of rage, twisted into a grotesque mask. Veins throbbed in his neck, stark cords against his leathery hide. "Insolent pup!" he bellowed, the sound reverberating off the tin walls of the makeshift eatery. "You dare question me? After all I've provided." Razor swallowed hard, meeting Viper's furious glare. "You offered sanctuary, a semblance of belonging. But that doesn't grant you carte blanche. Not when innocents suffer." With a sweeping gesture, he indicated the slumbering town beyond the highway, and Maggie's humble refuge. A wave of murmurs swept through the gathered bikers' heads swiveled, eyes flickered, weighing the shifting balance of power. Knuckles, still cradling his bruised hand, remained a silent sentinel, a landscape of worry etched onto his face. Gina, casually leaning against her customized machine, a wrench swinging idly from her gauntlet, observed the scene with open satisfaction. A sly grin tugged at her lips. She'd sown the seeds of rebellion, and Razor was now tending the burgeoning revolt. "Innocent." Viper spat the word like poison. "She's a relic, a phantom. She courted this fate. She shielded others from your rage," Razor countered. "She offered you a way out. You refused it." Viper advanced, his towering frame casting a shadow over Razor. The reek of leather and stale brew washed over him, an oppressive wave of intimidation. "You tread a dangerous path, boy. A fatal one." Razor didn't yield. The fear that had once shackled him now mingled with a startling sense of purpose. He was no longer just Razor, the grease monkey, the pawn swept along by the Iron Serpents' current. He was fighting for something, for someone. "Perhaps," Razor replied, his voice a low, resonant hum. "But I'd rather meet my end standing tall than groveling at your feet." Silence descended, heavy and absolute. The only sound was the distant drone of a passing 18-wheeler and the frantic drumbeat of Razor's pulse. Then, a gravelly voice shattered the quiet. "He's got a point, Viper." All eyes swiveled towards a mountainous figure at the rear. Brick, a long-standing member of the Iron Serpents, renowned for his unwavering devotion and ruthless efficiency, lumbered forward as he stroked his beard, his gaze unflinching. "This ain't about the code no more, it's about you throwing a fit, 'cause a woman outsmarted you." Another biker, a lithe woman known as Sparrow, chimed in. "Yeah, Viper. Your personal vendetta risks dragging us all down." One by one, others added their voices to the chorus of dissent. The Iron Serpents, once a monolithic entity, were now splintering, factions were emerging, lines being drawn in the gritty dust. Viper's eyes narrowed to slits, his face flushing a dangerous shade of purple. You treacherous dogs," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "I forged this crew. I gave you everything. You built it." "Sure," Gina said, pushing herself upright. "But you're steering it straight into the abyss. We need a leader who uses his brain, not his ego." The air throbbed with anticipation. The pivotal moment had arrived. Would the Iron Serpents rally behind Viper, or would they forge a new destiny? Viper swung his incandescent gaze back to Razor. "You," he hissed, jabbing a thick finger. "You instigated this. You'll rue this day. I'll make you wish you'd never crossed paths with Maggie." Razor steeled himself, bracing for impact, but it never came. Viper wavered, his eyes flicking nervously across the faces of his former followers, now etched with doubt and defiance. He recognized the cracks in his authority, the crumbling edifice of his power. Instead of striking Razor, Viper snatched his helmet from the handlebars of his motorcycle. He slammed it onto his head with savage force. "Fine," he spat, his voice muffled and distorted. "You want to play this game? Fine. See how far your loyalty gets you when the wolves start circling." He jolted the engine to life, its roar a thunderous declaration. He revved it repeatedly, a blatant show of force, then whipped the bike around, showering gravel and dust as he roared from the lot, vanishing into the inky expanse of night. The remaining bikers stood transfixed, the echoes of Viper's departure reverberating through the air. The void left by his departure was almost tangible. Gina stepped forward, her eyes sweeping across the assembly with calculating precision. "Well," she announced, her voice clipped and commanding. "That was enlightening. Looks like we have choices to make." She glanced directly at Razor, starting with a little powwow with Maggie. Knuckles sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. He knew this was far from settled. Viper wouldn't simply vanish, he would return. Thirsting for retribution, Razor, still trembling slightly, experienced a strange sense of release. He had spoken his truth, and he had survived. His gaze drifted towards the diner, where Maggie stood watching, her expression inscrutable. That he sensed that the real conflict was just beginning. The battle lines were drawn, and now they had to pledge their allegiance. Sparrow approached Razor and clapped him on the back. "Not bad, kid," she said, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "Not bad at all." Brick nodded in agreement. "Showed some stones. More than Vipers got these days." The atmosphere, while still charged, was subtly shifting. There was a flicker of possibility in the air, a chance to rebuild, to redefine the Iron Serpents. But it was a path riddled with peril. Viper, wounded and consumed by fury, would be a formidable adversary. Gina cleared her throat, cutting through the lingering tension. "All right, people," she said, her voice radiating authority. "Let's not stand around congratulating ourselves. We need a plan. And we need it now." She fixed Razor with a direct stare, starting with a little chat with Maggie. The roadside rumble. The first punch detonated in the suddenly silent diner. A mountain of a man, etched with the chronicles of old brawls, his biker leathers creaking, drove his fist into the jaw of a callow prospect who dared question Viper's recent excesses. The kid crashed to the floor, the chair beneath him dissolving into a heap of kindling. Gina's roar ripped through the escalating tension, a sound pulled from the gut. "Enough!" she thundered, slamming her wrench onto the counter. It rang out, a metallic premonition of the coming chaos. Viper's gone off the deep end, and anyone who can't see that's got rocks in their head. That was the fuse. The powder keg blew. Two more bikers lunged, fists blurring. A table flipped, sending ceramic mugs skating across the greasy tiles, their dark brew staining the floor a dismal sepia. The jukebox, still crooning a lonesome ballad, seemed to keen as a stray blow spiderwebbed its glass face. Behind the counter, Maggie felt that familiar chill creep over her. It wasn't fear, not anymore. This was a honed awareness, a precise understanding of trajectory and force, a silent equation for curtailing the pandemonium without undue harm. She'd navigated far grimmer melees before. Razor, caught in the eye of the storm, became a vortex of limbs and ire. He flowed with surprising grace, evading a wild swing here, connecting with a sharp uppercut there. But the odds were stacked against him, and the momentum was shifting. Maggie moved. She crossed the room with deceptive speed, a specter in the fray. A biker brandished a tire iron at Razor. Maggie intervened, not with sheer power, but with a targeted strike to his wrist. The iron clanged to the floor, and the biker doubled over, cradling his tingling hand. She aimed to neutralize, not maim. Another biker, a behemoth of muscle sporting a ZZ-top beard, charged at her, bellowing like a goaded bull. Maggie pivoted, her hand a swift blur as she liberated him of his belt. At a deft flick, and the metal buckle found the pressure point behind his ear. He dropped like a felled redwood, snoring softly. "Mac, get clear!" Razor shouted, breathless, as he dodged another haymaker. Maggie ignored him. Retreat wasn't an option. This was her domain, her refuge, and she wouldn't see it violated. Besides, Razor was family now, and she guarded her own fiercely. The brawl spilled from the diner, a churning mass of leather and muscle. Bodies tumbled onto the gritty roadside, disrupting the desultory traffic. A battered pickup screeched to a halt, its driver erupting in a string of colorful curses. Gina, wielding her wrench like a barbaric scepter, held her own against two hulking opponents. She was an untamed force, a Valkyrie clad in leather and soaked in engine oil. But even her stamina was waning. Maggie recognized an opening, snatching a handful of coffee beans from a nearby jar. She launched them at the bikers with a flick of her wrist, like tiny, stinging projectiles. The sudden assault on their eyes disrupted their formation, giving Gina the fraction of a second she needed to deliver a crippling blow. The conflict was a savage dance of desperation and pent-up fury, born from years of simmering resentment and fueled by Viper's increasingly unhinged behavior. It was a catharsis, a draining of the venom that had been poisoning the Iron Serpents. Abruptly, a horn blasted, insistent and deafening. A semi-truck, its air brakes hissing like an angry serpent, bore down on the skirmish, its driver plainly unimpressed by the roadside ruckus. "Get out of the road!" the driver bellowed, leaning out of his cab. "You want to get yourself smeared." The warning, coupled with the combatants' growing exhaustion, seemed to break the hypnotic grip of violence. The fighting began to subside, the brutality receding like a falling wave. Razor, bruised and breathless but upright, surveyed the wreckage. Bikers lay scattered on the asphalt, tending to their hurts. Others helped each other up, their faces etched with a mix of contrition and relief. Gina, her face ablaze with adrenaline, leaned heavily on her wrench. "Well," she croaked, "that was cleansing." Maggie emerged from the diner, her expression an enigma. "It's not finished," she stated, her voice low but resolute. "Viper won't let this slide." A weighty silence descended, punctuated only by the drone of passing vehicles. Everyone knew she spoke truth. Viper wouldn't accept defeat. Retaliation was inevitable, swift and merciless. Razor met Maggie's gaze, his own brimming with gratitude and apprehension. "We'll be ready," he replied, his tone unwavering. "We're done being afraid." Maggie nodded, a ghost of a smile gracing her lips. "Good," she said, "because fear is a privilege we can no longer afford." The sun sank beneath the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the blacktop. The air cooled, carrying the scent of dust and combustion. The roadside diner, formerly a sanctuary of calm, now stood as a battle-marred witness to the gathering storm. As the sky deepened to indigo, Gina spoke, her voice hushed and grave. "We need a strategy. Viper's got pull, resources. We can't just hunker down and wait for him to come knocking." Razor confirmed with a nod. "Gina's right. We need a plan, and to figure out who's with us and who's still drinking Viper's Kool-Aid." Maggie pivoted and re-entered the diner. She retrieved a broom and began to sweep up the shattered glass and toppled furniture. A modest action, yet a beginning. "We'll sort it," she assured, her voice echoing in the desolate space. "We always do." Her gaze drifted to the desert horizon, where the first pinpricks of starlight appeared. The boundless expanse threatened to swallow them, a stark reminder of their isolation, their precariousness. But Maggie felt no dread. She had weathered far harsher conditions, and she had always found a path to survival. This juncture would prove no different. She had a diner to safeguard, a family to shield, and a past to ultimately bury. And she would exhaust every recourse to ensure their deliverance from the imminent tempest. The air throbbed with the ominous promise of further violence, yet also with something else. A faint flicker of hope, a fiery spark of resistance, a quiet resolve to carve a new destiny, away from the shadows of yesterday and toward a future where absolution remained within reach. The Iron Serpents were fractured, crippled, but perhaps, from the wreckage, something resilient could emerge, something stronger, something redeemed. Justice arrives. The diner reeked of stale beer, spilled coffee, and ozone, a peculiar cocktail born of violence and desperation. Gina and her crew were patching themselves up, a grim ballet of bandages and muttered curses. Razor was already back behind the counter, wiping down the least offensive sections with a grim determination. Maggie stood sentinel, a silent promise of retribution etched onto her face. The approaching headlights were the only sound louder than the ringing in her ears. Dusty Johnson's cruiser crunched to a halt outside, the beam cutting through the pre-dawn gloom like a surgical laser. He emerged, a tall, lean figure in a worn uniform. His face weathered by years of desert sun and questionable decisions. He adjusted his Stetson, a silent acknowledgement of the chaos that undoubtedly awaited him. Johnson had a radar for trouble, and the sudden spike in emergency calls from this. dusty corner of nowhere had set off every alarm he possessed. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the scene, the overturned tables, the bloodstains, the general air of controlled mayhem. He raised an eyebrow, a gesture that spoke volumes. "Mornin', folks?" he drawled, his voice a low rumble that cut through the tension. "Seems like y'all had a spirited discussion." Gina, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward, her knuckles still raw. "Just a disagreement, officer. Nothing we couldn't handle ourselves." Johnson's eyes, the color of faded denim, flickered to Maggie. "Ma'am!" Maggie met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "The situation is under control, officer." Johnson wasn't buying it. He'd seen enough bar fights in his time to recognize the difference between a friendly scuffle and a full-blown war. He noticed the way the others deferred to her, the subtle respect in their eyes. This woman, whoever she was the anchor in this storm. That he addressed Gina again. "Anyone need medical attention?" "We're fine," Gina insisted. A little too quickly, Johnson shrugged, a gesture that suggested he wasn't particularly concerned with their well-being, but more with the paperwork he'd have to fill out if someone ended up 6 feet under. He turned his attention to the real problem. He hadn't seen Viper since the old biker was a snot-nosed brat causing trouble, and the whispers he'd heard about the Iron Serpents lately painted a disturbing picture. "Where's Viper?" Johnson asked, his voice hardening slightly. A flicker of unease passed through the group, and no one spoke. Just then, the roar of an engine shattered the silence. Viper, realizing the game was up, was making a break for it. He burst through the back door, scrambling onto his customized Harley, its chrome glinting ominously in the dim light. He revved the engine, the sound a defiant snarl. "Hold it right there," Johnson bellowed, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. But Maggie was faster, with a speed that belied her composed demeanor. She moved. She cleared the counter in a single fluid motion, her boots barely making a sound on the worn floorboards. She was outside before Johnson could even blink. Viper, seeing her, sneered. "Get out of my way, sweetheart. This ain't your fight." Maggie didn't answer. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on Viper. She knew she couldn't let him leave. Not only would he regroup and come back stronger, but he'd also continue to poison this town with his brutality. Viper gunned the engine, preparing to run her down. He underestimated her as the bike surged forward. Maggie sidestepped with practiced ease in one swift motion. She delivered a precise, powerful kick to the bike's exposed carburetor. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The sudden silence deafening Viper, caught off guard, lost control, and the bike swerved violently, throwing him off. He landed hard, sprawling in the dirt. Johnson watched, stunned, his hand still hovering near his weapon. He'd seen a lot of things in his career, but he'd never seen anyone disable a motorcycle with a single kick. He slowly lowered his hand. Maggie stood over Viper, her expression implacable. "It's over, Viper." Viper, spitting dirt, glared up at her. "You haven't seen the last of me, bitch. The serpents will tear you apart." Maggie remained unmoved. "The serpents are tearing themselves apart. You're the one who's finished." Johnson finally caught up, cuffing Viper before he could get to his feet. He hauled him up, his grip firm. "Looks like you're going for a ride, Viper. A long one." As Johnson led Viper towards the cruiser, he glanced back at Maggie, a flicker of something akin to respect in his eyes. "You know, ma'am, this is probably the most excitement this town's seen in years. I appreciate you making my job interesting." Maggie offered a ghost of a smile. "Just trying to keep the peace, officer." Johnson chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Right? Well, you have a good one. And try to keep the noise down. Will you? Some of us are trying to sleep." He shoved Viper into the back of the cruiser and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle disappeared down the dusty road, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting had stopped, a silence pregnant with possibilities. The air still crackled with tension, but there was also a sense of hope. Gina approached Maggie, her face etched with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "What do we do now?" Maggie looked at her, her gaze steady. Now we rebuild. She looked to Razor, who nodded, and then to the rest of the group. We decide what kind of serpents we're going to be. The words hung heavy in the air, an unspoken commitment to a new beginning. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in a long time, they had a chance to choose their own destiny. The first rays of dawn painted the desert sky in hues of pink and gold, a silent promise of a brighter future. Justice had arrived, not in the form of a judge or jury, but in the quiet strength of a woman who refused to let darkness prevail. The aftermath. Dusty Johnson's face, framed by aviator sunglasses, pulsed with the lurid pink of the diner's neon sign. He navigated the wreckage of a shattered table, the air thick with the acrid tang of stale brew and spilled gasoline. "Mac," he rumbled, his voice a low thrum that vibrated through the floor. "Seems you've had a lively night." Maggie, behind the counter, wiped its surface with meticulous economy. "Keeping order, Sheriff? Like yourself." A dry chuckle rasped in his throat. "Indeed, and I suppose Viper simply walked face first into that powerful right hook of yours?" He indicated the prone biker, moaning softly, his features a grotesque tapestry of swelling bruises. "He contested his apprehension," Maggie stated, her tone devoid of inflection. Dusty shook his head, a ghost of a smile gracing his lips. "Contested apprehension? That's a novel approach." He clapped his hands. "All right, boys. Let's get these vipers caged." Two deputies, visibly queasy, moved in to shackle Viper and his remaining adherents. Resentment hung heavy in the air, a palpable miasma. They muttered veiled threats, their gazes venomous, yet none dared overtly challenge the law in Dusty's presence as Viper was hoisted upright. His eyes, twin embers of pure spite, locked onto Maggie. "This isn't finished, Callahan, mark my words." Maggie held his gaze, unwavering. "Yes, it is, Viper. Quite finished." Dusty propelled Viper toward the exit with a firm hand. "Save the threats for the judge, champ." He watched as they were crammed into the patrol car, its oscillating lights painting the nocturnal desert with strokes of crimson and cerulean. Silence descended on the diner once they were gone, a near-palpable weight. The remnant Iron Serpents huddled together, their visages a canvas of shame and uncertainty. Razor, shoulders slumped in defeat, stepped forward. "Mac," he started, his voice a mere exhalation. "We." He swallowed hard, groping for the appropriate words. "We truly erred." Maggie continued her methodical cleaning, her expression a blank slate. No easy absolution offered. He needed to articulate it. "We placed our faith in Viper." Razor persevered, his voice gaining resonance. "We envisioned him as a protector, a source of strength, but he was merely a brute and a craven bully." He glanced at the other bikers, their faces mirroring his own burgeoning understanding. "He exploited us, all of us." Turning back to Maggie, his eyes conveyed his plea. "I apologize, Mac. We collectively apologize for the devastation, the turmoil we ignited, for everything." Maggie paused at last, her gaze penetrating. "Apologies mend no windows, Razor." "Agreed," Razor conceded. "But we will repair the windows, that we will rectify everything." He straightened his posture. "We will expunge this mess, Mac, every last fragment, and we will compensate for the damages that to the last penny." A subtle flicker, possibly hope, perhaps something more enigmatic, momentarily illuminated Maggie's features. "Very well," she conceded, her voice still guarded. "Commence." The bikers moved with renewed purpose. The swagger, the bombast, had vanished, replaced by a quiet resolve, an aspiration to atone. They began gathering the shards of glass, sweeping the floor, righting the toppled furniture. Dusty watched them, leaning against the counter, a toothpick his only companion. "Impressive," he commented to Maggie. "You've induced them to self-clean, that I never anticipated witnessing that." Maggie merely shrugged. "They created the mess. They remediate it. It's deeper than that." Mac, Dusty countered, his gaze pensive. They're seeking something, a reason to exist, something to invest belief in. He paused, studying her. And I suspect they might have discovered it in you. Maggie offered no reply, instead focusing on brewing a fresh batch of coffee. The rich aroma permeated the air, a meager solace amidst the lingering chaos. The bikers labored in silence, their movements surprisingly coordinated. Razor orchestrated their efforts. His voice steady and authoritative, he was a changed man, devoid of the boasting and posturing that had previously defined him. As they labored, the first tendrils of dawn began to paint the firmament in hues of rose and apricot. The arid landscape, typically harsh and unforgiving, was bathed in a gentle, ethereal glow. When the sun fully ascended, the diner was nearly restored to its prior state. The shattered windows were boarded, the floor swept, the tables returned to their upright positions. The sole vestiges of the night's turbulence were the faint stains on the floor and the lingering odor of gasoline. Razor approached Maggie, his face marked with dust and grime. "We are finished, Mac," he announced. "We will secure the windows first thing in the morning, and we will compensate for all else too. Merely inform us of the sum owed." Maggie surveyed the diner, absorbing the scene. She perceived the exhaustion etched on the bikers' faces, the genuine remorse reflected in their eyes. She discerned something additional, a glimmer of hope, a desire for a brighter trajectory. "I shall calculate it," she responded, her voice gentler now. "Just rest, you have earned it." The bikers hesitated, uncertain. Razor looked at Maggie, a silent question in his eyes. "Proceed," Maggie urged, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "Partake in some coffee on the house." A collective exhalation of relief rippled through the bikers. They gravitated toward the counter, their faces breaking into tired smiles. Dusty pushed away from the counter. "Well, Mac," he observed, "it appears you've acquired a crew." Maggie remained silent, turning to the coffee machine, her movements measured. She filled a cup, the dark liquid steaming in the morning light. She savored a sip, the flavor sharp and robust. The future remained uncertain. The road ahead, long and arduous. But for the first time in what felt like eons, Maggie felt a spark of optimism. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could forge something new from the remnants of the old. Perhaps she could assist these lost souls in discovering their paths. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could attain tranquility at last. As Dusty turned to leave, he paused and said, "You know, Mac, you're one tough woman. Just remember, even the toughest need a hand sometimes. Don't be afraid to call." With that, he tipped his hat and stepped into the morning sun. The sound of his patrol car died away, leaving Maggie with her thoughts and her new, improbable crew. The storm on the horizon, it seemed, had yet to fully break. A second chance. The silence pressed down, thick as the friar's fumes, the only sound. The buzz of the neon sign, its pale promise of caffeine and comfort a beacon in the encroaching dawn. Maggie observed the remnants of the Iron Serpents, a huddle of leather and shame shrinking near the splintered window panes. Viper's absence echoed. A palpable void where bravado had reigned, stripped of his influence. They seemed diminished, vulnerable. She methodically wiped the already gleaming counter. The repetitive action, a small rebellion against the suffocating tension. Let them stew in their guilt. Let the enormity of their actions crush them. Finally, the chime of Razor's belt buckle slicing through the quiet. That he edged forward, eyes fixed on anything but her. Maggie, we really messed things up." Maggie offered no reply, only the steady rhythm of her cleaning, her gaze unwavering. She'd weathered storms far fiercer than a collection of bruised bikers. "Viper, he wasn't always this way." Razor started, the words dissolving into weak excuses. Even to himself she'd heard them all, in every dialect of regret, each laced with the same pathetic bid for leniency. Maggie ceased her scrubbing. She leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "He is now." Razor winced. He studied the stained linoleum, a brutal tapestry of the night's mayhem. "Yeah, he is. And we went along. We're sorry. For the wreckage, for frightening you." for everything. Another protracted silence. Then, a sigh escaped Maggie, a whisper in the stillness. From beneath the counter, she produced a fresh cloth. Start cleaning. That broken glass won't magically disappear. A ripple of murmurs went through the group. Razor looked up, surprise etching his features. You're not calling the cops. Dusty's already been here. She nodded toward the back. He'll be back. He agrees, though. Cleaning up might be the best course for everyone. A gesture towards the coffee pot. Coffee's hot. Help yourselves. Relief flooded the air, thick enough to taste. Tentatively, like skittish animals, they stirred. Slowly, a few began gathering the larger shards, their movements awkward but sincere. Razor, grabbing a broom, started sweeping. His brow furrowed in concentration. Gina, the woman whose arm sported a twisting wrench tattoo, remained by the door, arms crossed, an indecipherable expression on her face. She'd uttered not a sound. Yet Maggie sensed a boiling rage beneath the hardened exterior, not directed at her, but at Viper, at their predicament, at the shambles they were in. Maggie poured herself coffee, the fragrant steam swirling around her face. A sip, and the warmth spread. Through her limbs, she watched the Iron Serpents, humbled and subdued, attempting to erase the evidence of their transgression. It was a paltry start, but a start nonetheless. Razor, she said, her voice slicing cleanly through the diminished hum. Come here. He abandoned the broom and approached the counter, his eyes downcast. Yeah, Mac? What are you going to do about this? She swept her hand, encompassing the destruction, the boarded windows, the splintered furniture, the besmirched reputation. About the Iron Serpents. He lifted his head, his gaze finally meeting hers. A flicker ignited there. Something beyond fear or regret. Was it hope? I don't know. But this can't continue, Viper. He's lost his grip. He's dragging us all under. So what will you do? Maggie pressed, her tone level, yet firm. Razor inhaled deeply, straightening his shoulders. I'm going to change it. I'm going to change the Iron Serpents. Will be different. Will be better. Maggie arched a skeptical brow. Those are just words, Razor. I know, he said, sincerity lacing his voice. But I mean them. I swear that we can mend this, that we can rebuild, that we can become something worthwhile. He glanced at the other bikers, their faces grimy but resolute. Right? Nods of assent rippled through the group. Gina pushed off the wall and joined them at the counter. He's right, she stated, her voice gravelly but firm. Viper's been a liability for ages. This was the final blow. She looked at Razor, a hint of softening in her gaze. I'm in. I'll help you rebuild. But it'll be a brutal fight. Viper won't cede control easily. I know, Razor responded, his jaw tightening. But we have to try. Maggie assessed them, these fractured, beaten-down bikers, clinging desperately to the notion of redemption. She recognized in their eyes an echo of her own past despair. That same fierce longing for a new beginning. She knew the path ahead would be unforgiving, fraught with obstacles. Viper wouldn't relinquish his hold without a vicious struggle. There would be trials, failures, and moments of crippling doubt. But she also detected something else, a nascent potential, a spark of decency fighting to emerge from the shadows. Another sip of coffee, the bitterness of familiar comfort. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could succeed. Perhaps they could transcend their past and forge a better existence. But it wouldn't come without a price. Nothing ever did. All right, she said, her voice steely. Here's the deal. This place gets cleaned. The windows are fixed. The damages are paid in full. Then we can discuss what happens next. Razor grinned, a genuine smile transforming his hard features. You got it, Mac. You won't be sorry. He turned to the others, newfound authority ringing in his tone. Let's move. And this time we get it done right. The bikers moved with revitalized vigor, their earlier hesitation replaced by a palpable sense of purpose. They swept, they scrubbed, They hammered, their movements a symphony of controlled chaos. Maggie watched, her expression a carefully constructed mask. She knew she was gambling, extending these men a second chance. They could easily double-cross her, revert to their old ways, and drag her back into the abyss she'd fought so hard to escape. But something in their eyes, some kernel of desperation, had resonated within her. She saw in them a reflection of her former self, a stark reminder of the darkness she'd managed to outrun, and maybe, just maybe, she could help them do the same. As the first tendrils of dawn snaked across the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of rose and gold, the diner slowly began to reclaim its identity. The shattered windows were boarded, the fractured furniture replaced, and the floor scrubbed to a semblance of its former glory. The Iron Serpents were far from achieving true redemption, but they had taken the initial, crucial step. And as Maggie observed their efforts, she couldn't suppress a flicker of hope. Maybe, against all odds, a second chance was possible after all. Building bridges. The percussive clang of hammer against steel resonated across the arid expanse, a stark industrial counterpoint to the wind's whisper. Gina, bandana knotted tight, wrestled with a buckled sheet of metal, coaxing it back into shape with surprising care. Nearby, Razor, face a canvas of grime, meticulously filled a blast-pocked hole in the diner wall, Viper's destructive legacy fading under fresh plaster. Once emblems of menace, the Iron Serpents had transformed into a makeshift construction crew, a ragtag assembly of carpenters, painters, and handymen toiling under Maggie's watchful, if dubious, eye. Inside the last stop, she leaned against the familiar, scarred counter, cradling a mug of lukewarm coffee. The air, thick with the tang of plaster and motor oil, had displaced the ghost of smoke and fear and odd alchemy. Yet Maggie found it almost soothing. She observed the former terrorizers, now diligently repairing the damage they'd inflicted, that a fragile tendril of hope unfurled within her, too delicate to fully trust. "Never imagined," she remarked, her voice slicing through the din, "I'd see the Iron Serpents contribute something besides chaos." Gina paused, wiping perspiration with a grimy hand. "Viper isn't the Iron Serpents, Maggie," she countered, her tone gruff but honest. "He just usurped us, convinced us his path was the only one." "And you bought it?" Maggie challenged, arching a brow. Gina scoffed. "Some had little choice. Some needed the camaraderie, the shield, a place to belong." Her gaze dropped to her weathered hands, etched with hardship. "But Viper, he overstepped. He lost sight of what family meant, even a twisted one like ours." Razor approached, his expression earnest. "We're atoning. Maggie, don't we know we screwed up royally? We want to earn back your good faith." Maggie scrutinized them, searching their faces for deceit. She found instead exhaustion, remorse, and a flicker of burgeoning optimism. "Trust is a currency earned," she said, her voice losing some of its edge, "not freely dispensed." The work resumed, a symphony of reconstruction filling the air. Days bled into a routine. The serpents arrived before dawn, labored relentlessly, and departed only when swallowed by night. Maggie, reciprocally, began offering glimpses into her past, snippets of life before the diner, before the wasteland. Before it all, she painted pictures of the city, the downpour, the thronging crowds. She recounted stories gleaned from books, places she'd only visited in daydreams. Hesitantly, she mentioned her grandmother, the unconventional woman who'd taught her both to bake and to brawl. They listened, transfixed. For individuals who'd existed on society's periphery, Maggie's narratives were portals into unseen worlds. They recognized her not just as a survivor, but as a person. They started to appreciate the quiet fortitude that emanated from her, a strength rooted not in violence, but in unwavering resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, igniting the sky in a blaze of color, the distinctive thrum of an engine heralded visitors. Sarah and Lily Jenkins limped up to the last stop, their faces mirroring the landscape's weariness. Sarah hesitated before leaving the vehicle, her gaze sweeping the scene. The sight of the Iron Serpents, diligently laboring on the diner, stopped her in her tracks. She tightened her grip on Lily's hand, apprehension clouding her features. Maggie spotted them, and a rare, genuine smile touched her lips. "Sarah." "Lily. Get on in, you two look parched." Sarah remained wary, but Lily tugged insistently. "Mommy, I'm thirsty." They approached cautiously, their eyes flicking between the bikers and Maggie. Gina, sensing Sarah's unease, suspended her hammering and offered a tentative, almost sheepish, smile. "Just lending Maggie a hand sprucing up the place," she explained, her voice surprisingly gentle. Sarah nodded slowly, still unconvinced. They stepped inside, the chime above the door signaling a welcome. The interior air was cool, redolent with the aroma of lemonade. Lily's eyes widened, drawn to the vibrant array of candies gracing the counter. Maggie poured them both glasses of lemonade, adding an extra splash of ice for Lily. "On the house," she said, her gaze meeting Sarah's. "You look like you've had a rough one." Sarah accepted the drink gratefully, her shoulders relaxing infinitesimally. "We were trying to rustle up some work in the next town over at Dice. Times are hard everywhere," Maggie replied, leaning against the counter. "But they don't last forever." Lily, who had been quietly savoring her lemonade, suddenly piped up. "You're nice," she declared, looking directly at Maggie. Maggie was caught off guard. She wasn't accustomed to being labeled nice. Truth be told, she wasn't sure she even was. But Lily's earnest gaze held no prejudice, only a pure, unfiltered observation. "Thank you, Lily," Maggie said, her voice softer than she intended. Sarah, witnessing the exchange, felt a spark of warmth toward Maggie. She had always sensed an underlying decency beneath the woman's hardened exterior, a kindness she had been reluctant to embrace. But Lily, with her untarnished perspective, seemed to perceive it clearly as they sat there, sipping their drinks. A nascent sense of community blossomed. The sounds of construction receded into the background, replaced by the subdued hum of conversation. Maggie found herself opening up more freely than she had in years, sharing fragments of her history, her aspirations, her anxieties. She articulated her vision of creating a sanctuary, a haven where people could find reprieve from the desert's unforgiving reality. Gina and Razor, intuiting the shift in atmosphere, joined them. They recounted their own stories, tales of adversity and perseverance, of missteps and the hard-won wisdom they yielded. They voiced their determination to change, to forge a brighter future, not just for themselves, but for the entire community. For the first time since arriving in this arid land, Maggie felt a flicker of something she had long suppressed: optimism. Not just for her own sake, but for everyone around her. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could build something new here, something better, something enduring. As Sarah and Lily prepared to depart, Sarah turned to Maggie, offering a genuine smile. "Thank you, Maggie," she said, "for everything." Maggie nodded, her gaze meeting Sarah's. "Anytime, Sarah. Anytime." As they drove off, Lily waved goodbye, her small hand vanishing behind the truck's window. Maggie watched them go, a sense of tranquility washing over her. The last stop remained a work in progress, both structurally and metaphorically. But it was gradually, painstakingly, evolving into more than just a roadside haven. It was becoming a sanctuary, a destination for second chances, a place where even the most calloused hearts could discover a fragile glimmer of hope. And Maggie, the woman who had once craved only solitude, was beginning to understand that she was no longer standing alone. The last stop. A new beginning. The wind sharpened its teeth. A subterranean rumble felt more than heard beneath the floorboards of the last stop. Maggie's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, a churning ochre vista threatening a dust cloud worthy of biblical wrath. She buffed the already gleaming countertop, each movement a study in efficiency, born of long practice. The rich, dark perfume of brewing coffee clung to the air, a momentary shield against the coming desolation. A choked cough from an engine heralded a newcomer. Maggie knew that sound: a vintage Ford pickup, likely held together by grit and wishful thinking. She settled against the counter, expectant. The door groaned open, admitting a woman cloaked in dust and weariness. The little girl, barely 6, sought sanctuary behind her mother's faded denim skirt, only half her face visible. Afternoon. The woman's voice, a dry rasp, cracked slightly. Word is, you serve the best coffee for miles around. Maggie inclined her head, a genuine smile gracing her lips. So they say that I'm Maggie. What can I get you? Sarah. The woman offered. And this is Lily. 2 coffees. Black, please. And perhaps, something for her. Juice boxes in the cooler. Maggie gestured. And freshly baked cookies this morning. Lily risked a peek, her eyes, huge and serious, scrutinizing Maggie, and smile. No word, just that unnerving, unwavering gaze. Sarah gave her daughter's hand a reassuring squeeze. A cookie sounds lovely, sweetie. As Maggie filled the order, a familiar prickle of observation settled on her skin. Not hostile, no, but wary, laced with a blend of anticipation and fear. The ghost of that look haunted her own memory. Consider the sweets on the house, Maggie said, sliding the cookie and juice across the polished surface. Sarah's brows lifted in surprise. Oh, I couldn't. A welcome gift to the last stop, Maggie countered, her tone gentle but firm. Sarah hesitated, then conceded with a grateful smile. Thank you. Lily reached, her small fingers daintily peeling back the wrapper. She nibbled, her gaze unwavering. Just then, the back door slammed inward, and Gina stormed in, a thundercloud brewing on her face. That blasted espresso machine is acting up again, Mac. I swear, I'm about to dismantle it with a pipe wrench.
Maggie sighed.
What's its latest rebellion? Frothers hissing steam like a rabid reptile. Pressure valve, I reckon. Gina noticed Sarah and Lily, and her features softened marginally, though the scowl remained etched in place. Afternoon, ladies. Pay me no mind. Just battling recalcitrant machinery. Sarah nodded politely, but Lily recoiled, seeking further refuge behind her mother's leg. Gina's our resident mechanical wizard, Maggie explained, trying to smooth the air. Keeps the wheels turning, so to speak. Gina, uncharacteristically, seemed flustered by the praise. She just grunted, retreating towards the kitchen. Gotta wrangle it before the whole shebang detonates. As Gina vanished, Razor materialized from the rear, bearing a stack of freshly hewn firewood. He caught Maggie's eye, offering a barely visible nod, acknowledging the newcomers with silent courtesy. He placed the wood neatly by the stove, his movements economical, almost fluid despite his bulk. Sarah observed them both, her eyes tracking between Gina and Razor, a question forming behind them. They work here? She inquired, a note of suspicion coloring her voice. Maggie met her gaze levelly. They do. They're good people, Sarah. You can trust them. A considerable leap of faith. She knew, but she meant it. She did trust them. And, increasingly, she was starting to trust her own judgment again. Sarah didn't reply at once, merely sipped her coffee, her eyes still flitting around the space, absorbing the details. The mismatched chairs, the time-worn photographs adorning the wall, the subtle tang of motor oil mingling with the rich coffee scent. This place, it's different, she finally stated. It is, Maggie conceded, a constant work in progress. The sandstorm struck with savage force minutes later. The wind screamed, vibrating the glass in the windows, assaulting the walls. Visibility plummeted as the fine particles choked the air, transforming the world outside the last stop into a swirling brown vortex. Sarah gasped, drawing Lily closer. Oh, dear God. Easy now, Maggie reassured. It'll pass. This old place has seen worse. She guided them to a table tucked away in the back, far from the vulnerable windows. Razor stoked the fire, casting a warm, embracing glow throughout the room. Gina, unexpectedly, produced a well-worn children's book, placing it gingerly on the table before Lily. Thought she might want something to look at? Gina mumbled, avoiding any direct contact. Lily cautiously reached, her fingers tracing the faded cover. She opened it carefully, her eyes widening as she absorbed the vibrant illustrations. For the next hour, they sheltered from the tempest's fury. Sarah and Maggie talked, tentatively at first, then with growing openness. Sarah recounted her story. A failed marriage, a desperate flight from an untenable situation, a yearning for a sanctuary to begin anew. Maggie listened, offering quiet words of encouragement and subtle understanding. She held back the details of her own past, for now, but offered Sarah a glimmer of hope, an implicit promise of brighter days. Lily, lost in her book, occasionally glanced up at Maggie, her expression still unreadable. But Sarah detected a faint shift in her daughter's bearing, a softening in her tense shoulders, the fleeting suggestion of a smile playing around her mouth. As the storm began to wane, bathing the sky in hues of molten copper and plum, Sarah turned to Maggie, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, "for everything." Maggie smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her. "You're welcome, Sarah. You're safe here." Later, after Sarah and Lily had departed, promising to return, Maggie stood behind the counter, tidying up. Razor and Gina were in the back, engaged in a spirited debate about the relative virtues of different engine lubricants. The scent of coffee still permeated the air, mingling with the comforting aroma of wood smoke. The last stop was quiet, imbued with an unusual sense of tranquility. IT had become something more than just a roadside coffee dispensary. IT was a haven, a refuge, a place where fractured souls could find comfort and, perhaps, a second lease on life. Maggie stepped outside, drawn by the cool night air. The stars blazed against the inky canvas of the desert sky. A million tiny beacons. She gazed at the horizon, at the infinite expanse of the unknown, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a fragile sense of peace. The last stop. Not just the terminus of a journey, but the inception of a new one. And Maggie, flanked by her improbable allies, stood ready to confront whatever lay ahead.